Topic of this lecture, Gen Ed 130, is sex and gender. And I want to talk a little bit about the prep guide and the issues that were raised in the reading. The first thing to recognize is that sex, the word sex, is defined by social scientists as a biological characteristic. So the male versus female biological differentiation. Social scientists talk about primary characteristics or primary sex characteristics. These are organs related to reproduction, genitals, and so on. And secondary sex characteristics, which are not directly related to reproduction. Lower voice in men, breasts in women, larger muscles in men, broader hips in women. These are things that are not related to reproduction per se, but are differences that we see physically. Gender is a term that's defined by the society that you live in. It also uses the term male and female, or man and woman, or masculine and feminine. There tends to be a dichotomy, either or, a two-group, mutually exclusive situation. At least that's the way we think of it in American culture. It turns out that that's not universal across cultures. Social scientists discriminate or differentiate sex and gender. And gender, they say, is defined by the society that you live in. It is a social construct. It is the behavior and attitudes associated with being a male or a female, or masculine versus feminine. This is learned, this is socialized, this is conditioned. Okay? To say that wearing a skirt is what a woman does in America contradicts what men do in Scotland, where they wear kilts that look like skirts. All right? So behavior and attitudes associated with being male and female, it's perfectly fine for a man in Scotland to wear a kilt. In other countries, that may not be accepted. That doesn't mean that it's viewed as masculine in Scotland. It's not viewed as masculine in America. So that's why we talk about behaviors and attitudes with respect to gender, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the practices of particular groups of people. And masculinity and femininity are defined by our culture, not by our biology. So sex is biologically determined, the gender is culturally defined. Okay, so we see a lot of individual cultures influence and define what is male versus female in terms of our dress, in terms of our behavior, in terms of our roles in our cultures. We define them differently, and we see differences across the spectrum in terms of those sorts of things. So it's a little bit arbitrary, but it can be. There can be differences in dress, differences in behavior, differences in the social roles that we play. So what is this relationship between our physical makeup, our biological makeup, and our socialization, our culture, our society? Well, Money and Ehrandt followed a famous case study in which there were twin boys, and during circumcision, one of the boys' penises was cut off. Now, the parents decided, after much consideration, that they would change the boy's sex. They gave him a sex change operation. He was given female hormones, and so on, starting at 22 months. And at first, things seemed to go well. This girl was playing with dolls, dressing in dresses, doing all the things that are socially appropriate for an American girl to do. But at age 14, her father told her about the accident. She was actually born with a penis, but it was removed after this accident, and testicles, and blah, 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 blah. And this girl at the time said, "Oh my God, I've thought I was a boy all along, and I thought you were just making me be a girl," and so on. So David had a sex change operation again, got married, took male hormone treatment, and so on and so forth, and unfortunately committed suicide, but that's at least that story. In another related story is a study on Vietnam veterans um, and levels of testosterone. This was over 4,000 men, and what scientists found was that higher levels of testosterone were associated with more aggressiveness, higher incidence of getting into fights, lower paying jobs, more sexual partners, less likely to get or stay married. So what we might see is that masculinity is identified with testosterone and femininity may be identified with something else. So how do we resolve these, or how do we see this? Because in the Money and Ehrandt story, this young person received female hormones, but she didn't feel particularly female, and then received male hormones. And well, how does socialization play a role in this? Well, clearly hormones play an important role in gender. The two main hormones that we associate with masculinity and femininity are testosterone and estrogen, but it's a complicated it's a complicated story. Both men and women have testosterone and estrogen. We have a lot of other hormones that interact with these, notably oxytocin, for example. The other question is, what causes these things to be released? Why do you have testosterone? Why do the Vietnam veterans have high testosterone levels? Was it because they were just normally born with high testosterone? Or is it because they were hanging out with physical, aggressive, dominant men? And we know that testosterone, we know from other studies that testosterone can be released, can be induced, can be elicited by our situation, the environment that we live in, what we call the power pose. There's some evidence that it increases testosterone levels. So maybe think about the football game. Before the football game, what do? You get pumped up. Maybe that is a cause of testosterone release. So is the testosterone release the effect, or is it the cause? That becomes the real question. I think that both of these are at work. This is the nature-nurture question. I don't know that we're ever going to answer it, but we know that both are at work. We know that our situation, our environment, our circumstances affects our biology, and our biology affects our circumstances. That's how it goes. Our socialization affects how our biology is expressed. So when we encounter certain things, certain people, certain cases, we have to be subtle a little bit. There has to be some nuance in trying to understand where this person might be coming from. For example, this is a dissection of a mouse brain showing a region of the brain called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, the bed nucleus of the stria, or the BNST. Right? Now, what's key here is the central subdivision of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is sexually dimorphic, meaning that we see brain differences. We see differences in brain structures depending on whether you're a man or a woman. Now, what's very interesting is that, on average, the BSTC is twice as large in men as it is in women and contains twice the number of somatostatin neurons. However, trans women look more like women, and trans men look more like men than they do their sex. So maybe our biology is a little more complicated than we'd like to think. Maybe our biology is more than just our genitals. It's obviously more than just our genitals. So we can't identify a person's gender based on their sex. We can't just look between their legs and say, that's a man, that's a woman, because there are differences in other parts of the body that might be at play here. Okay, Patriarchy is a society in which men dominate women. Most of the authority is vested in males. And one of the arguments for the origins of the patriarchy are evolutionary in nature in motherhood. That is, that pregnancy and childbirth and nursing, which are conditions that women are going to be might be exposed to, put them in a vulnerable or needy position. You can't you can't be hunting while you're giving birth. It's hard to nurse and do various things. So men were the ones that hunted, created weapons, became versed in those sorts of things, and maybe that changed. Um, Maybe that led to more developed muscles. This may be the origin of patriarchy. It's an interesting story. We tend to play it out in many different ways. This is an interesting piece that I read recently where there are researchers out there that are saying things like men want beauty and women want wealth because those are the evolutionary pressures. Men, want the most beautiful, strong women to reproduce with. Women want men who can produce goods and services for them. This is the stuff. It turns out that in cultures that in which there's more equality in the sexes, that these sorts of gender roles are crumbling, which means that we're pretty flexible species. Women, we often talk, when we talk about women, we talk about the glass ceiling. This is the invisible barrier that prevents women from advancing to the top levels of work. This is what women are primarily used in support positions historically. Maybe there's a lack of mentors. Maybe it's cracking. Who knows? The class escalator is almost the opposite of this, and that is in traditionally women-dominated jobs like teaching and nursing and social workers. Men are generally given higher level positions, more desirable work assignments, and higher salaries. In other words, they move up faster than women in traditional women-dominated jobs. That's, again, evidence of a really unequal society. Okay, so that's what I have to say about that prep guide, and hopefully that clarified some of those points.